Hello, everybody. So getting to be late in the afternoon, but there's no more important topic today than safety. After all, whether it's a private company or whether it's government, safety comes first. And we're here to talk today at CoMotion, which I believe is a forward-thinking conference. All the movers and shakers that are doing new things technology-wise and mobility-wise are here. And, you know, technology and safety go hand in hand. Whether it's automation, whether it's platforms, whether it's managing things, you know, there's no more important topic than saving lives and, you know, making sure that, you know, people can move around safely. So we're, you know, in terms of the description of this panel, it's, you know, safety on the streets must be at the heart of the truly multimodal city, yet traffic deaths have been increasing in recent years. Even with the pandemic and the return of congestion, the numbers are going up despite the Vision Zero movement. Two big questions that we're going to be asking our panelists and the audience today. How are cities and companies using data and new technologies to try to reverse the trend? And number two, how can they reduce risks that come with the increasing variety of vehicles on our streets? And with our panelists here, we have a very interesting mix of perspectives, and we're going to go to the audience as well. So in terms of how we're going to proceed, I'll give you a little bit of a bio about myself, my perspective on the issue, introduce our panelists. They'll spend about 5 minutes talking about you know, what they do for a living and some of the things that they've seen and, on this topic. Then we're going to have some panel questions, and then we're going to go to the audience. So my name's Matt Daus. I'm the longest serving New York City Taxi and Limousine Commissioner. So we license and regulate the Ubers and the Lyfts and the taxis and the limos. And I survived and escaped New York City government about 12 years ago. I still have fresh wounds on my back from the highly charged political position it was, but very proud of a lot of the work that we did there. I have three hats that I wear now. I'm a transportation lawyer. I have a mobility practice. We do consulting and legal work for mobility companies of every mode all over the world. And so we see the legal angles and the risk mitigation when it comes to insurance and the types of lawsuits that are brought and the things that keep policymakers and the government and you know, also the private companies up at night. You know, the loss economically that could result from somebody being hurt or killed or injured, and what the lawyers do for a living, which is to sue for compensation. So I understand that aspect of things, but also I'm president of the International Association of Transportation Regulators. Jarvis, who just spoke at the last panel, he's the Technology and Innovation Committee chair of our group. We are taxi and TNC regulators, so government regulators as well as state regulators that license ground transportation, anything from a bus to a non-emergency medical transport vehicle, a TNC, a taxi, and we're kind of like the APTA or the NACTO of the taxi commissioners, and we do best practices and model regulations. So the last hat that I have is I'm also an academic. I'm the Transportation Technology Chair at the City University of New York, which is located up at City College in Harlem. And I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers on the panel. I'm going to say a few words about, you know, the ground transportation industry, and then each one of us is going to take it from there. So first, I learned today that in California and in Hollywood, even though I think I'm on the left side of the stage, I'm actually stage right. So stage left is Neha Chawla, who is the senior manager at the Transportation Planning at Los Angeles Metro. Had a lot of folks from Los Angeles Metro today. We're so happy to have you join us. She is from New Jersey originally, having gone to school at Rutgers, where she graduated with a political science degree, summa cum laude. She's been at LA Metro for over 10 years, has worked her way up the ladder there. She started as a transportation associate doing first and last mile, as well as sustainable policy planning for the agency. She was promoted to transportation planner, where she did the Metro van pool program, and also then became the principal transportation planner doing van pool and project management before taking on her current role. And to her right, in the middle of the stage, I think, is Craig Lozofsky, who is the Chief Operating Officer at MOTER Technologies. He serves on the board of Toyota Insurance in the U.S., 20 years of experience in the insurance industry. Last 10 years, he's been driving data analytics and modernizing auto. He got his education in aeronautical and astronautical engineering. Now he works for this company, but he has a long history in the insurance industry. So I guess you're the insurance expert on the panel today, which is an important topic.
That just makes me the target.
You are a target. He worked for Answer Financial for 14 years, which is now known as Allstate. Rose to Chief Marketing Officer, left in 2014. Then he went to serve and work for MyDrive, which is a global insurer based in Italy. He was the EVP and the general manager of that company. And then he became SVP of Zubi, a telematics startup serving the insurance industry. He worked for InsurTech and connected car startups. So he's very steeped in the art of the technology of telematics, which is an important part of this panel. And last but not least, we have Thibault Castagne, who is the CEO and co-founder at Vianova. He comes to us fresh from Paris, France, and has been doing some innovative things over in Europe, dealing with technology and some of what we heard on the last panel, micromobility and managing things. He could better explain it than I can. He's a serial entrepreneur in mobility and new energy ventures, a former data scientist at HSBC, and he's the former portfolio manager at a leading energy hedge fund, has an engineering degree, and he's going to talk a little bit about what he's doing with his technology platforms. Now, let me start off by just talking a little bit about my experiences. When I was commissioner of TLC, and we're going way back now, we're talking about the 1990s, we started doing Vision Zero before Vision Zero was a thing. There was no such thing as Vision Zero. Yet, all I heard was how unsafe the taxis were, and how there were no proper programs to get bad drivers off the road or to train them. So in 1998, everything kind of hit the fan when we had a very, very horrible accident that occurred that really was the perfect storm that led to massive changes in the New York City taxi industry, which affected many other cities around the globe. And there was two cabs that collided on Lexington Avenue, front page of the New York Times. A baby in a stroller was put into a coma, and a woman had her leg severed. It created selective reporting that went on for weeks, where every taxi accident was on the front page of the news. It was probably at a time where New Yorkers had pretty much had it with taxi cabs. You reach that moment in time where there's a problem and it just reaches its peak and everybody has a bad taxi story of an unsafe driver. It all hit the fan. And we had a huge taxi strike. We haven't had one since. Every taxi driver stayed home because we proposed rules that made it safer and more difficult to become a taxi driver. We put a defensive driving course in place. Believe it or not, it was a $100 fine if you were convicted of driving while intoxicated. $100 fine, and you could continue driving forever. Okay, there was no repercussions at the TLC. You wouldn't lose your license. We put mandatory drug testing in place. We put a point system in place that was stricter than the state to suspend and revoke taxi cab driver licenses. We raised the insurance limits, which we're allowed to do as a locality. So we did a lot of those things, and the industry got safer, incredibly safer, and a lot of other cities started replicating what we did. We also then, years later, in the early 2000s, we had a crisis with cell phones. Drivers were talking on their cell phones day in and day out. I don't have to teach anyone here about the harms of distracted driving. We were the first government agency anywhere in the U.S. to ban not just handheld phones, but hands-free phones before anybody else did. I got a lot of flack for it. I believe we saved lives by doing that. We had a 3 strikes and you're out rule. That was one thing that we did. And believe it or not, in the U.S., there are still a couple of states that allow you to text and drive, if you can believe that. I was the first regulator to put a telematics system in place for the taxi cabs. We did a pilot program in the early 2000s, and unfortunately, not many people, even though we had great insurance discounts, the black boxes that would monitor the driver's behavior, nobody wanted to use them because our industry is independent contractors. And the fleet owners were scared of being sued and investigated by the Labor Department and being accused of having employee drivers that are being controlled. And then, after we passed that, we had a very serious accident where that was similar to what happened in '98, where a little kid was killed by a taxi cab while crossing the street. It led to, around the time of the Vision Zero movement being started, it led to a law called Cooper's Law, which led to actual investigations of every taxi accident and crash in a reporting system to actually bring these drivers to justice. And if they were at fault, they would have their licenses revoked. And there's a lot of other things that came with that law, not just the crash reporting, but an educational component. It really kind of forms the taxi and for-hire vehicle and TNC portion of the Vision Zero movement and program in New York. Around the country, a lot of the taxi regulators, they don't really have a lot of mandates. Telematics are not mandated. Mostly Vision Zero is an educational thing. They talk about being safe in taxi school, but it doesn't have any teeth. You know, there's very few jurisdictions that really are able to, even though the technology is there, get unsafe drivers off the road or get them retrained when they're, you know, not driving correctly. And there's some companies that have done it in the limousine industry because they employ their drivers, so they're not scared of the labor lawsuits. And those companies have reported since the 1990s, with the primitive dash cams that were out there, across the board, a 50 to 60% reduction in crashes and in incidents and in claims. And I'm a lawyer. I used to be a plaintiff's lawyer representing plaintiffs in the early part of my career. Now I represent the companies that are accused of negligence for crashes. And not one case has gone to trial. Telematics with the vision and the cameras and the photos that are being taken is the great arbiter of justice, because there's no he said, she said anymore. There's no this person's a good witness and lying or really is persuasive. It's all about what happened. And you can tell whether someone's at fault almost immediately after a crash. It saves millions of dollars in terms of legal fees and insurance money being spent, and hopefully it will bring down the price of insurance. So that's kind of where we stand now. A lot of cities are doing automated enforcement. I just want to spend one extra second on this because the panel is going to be talking about it. You know, some cities now, as part of Vision Zero, you may have seen, are putting red light cameras and speed cameras in. You know, you can't really get points on your license in New York, right, if you're a driver, but the TLC gives taxi drivers points if they go through a red light. And they're definitely a lot safer, but there's still more to be done. The concept of mandates is an important issue that we want to talk about on this panel. And so now I'd like to hand it off to Neha, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the Vision Zero policies and the concept of mandates and incentives as well in LA. So Neha, maybe we could talk a little bit about what you've been doing at the agency and what the vision of the agency is for making all transportation safer.
Yes, absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Neha. I'm the senior manager in the first last mile department at Metro. So you might be familiar with a lot of the jurisdictional Vision Zero policies throughout the county and mandated by cities. But in January 2021, the Metro Board of Directors passed a motion to develop a street safety policy for Metro. And so in June of this year, actually, we passed that policy. It's a street safety, data sharing, and collaboration policy. And through that effort, there are several initiatives. And the ones I want to talk about today are related to innovation and data sharing. So this policy is supposed to be a guiding document for local jurisdictions. So ultimately, at the end of the day, like you mentioned, street safety, street policy isn't in Metro's hands. It lies solely with the local city jurisdictions to implement infrastructure improvements. But what we're trying to do is kind of develop a framework that they can use, like a collaborative process that that supports them and their initiatives, and really harness our data that is disaggregated. But we're hoping to kind of develop a group of stakeholders within the agency to really aggregate that data and use it in a really strategic way that could potentially help save countless lives, as you mentioned. Some statistics: in 2019, 719 people died from vehicle collisions. It was, I think, the fourth or fifth leading cause of death. And this disproportionately affects vulnerable communities, and especially the homeless population. And so for LA Metro being a public stakeholder in this conversation, it's really important for us to make sure that any type of policy discussions, any type of data discussions really focus on the core transit dependent, the people that are most impacted, and really at the ground level of these policies. So it is important to note that a lot of the regional and local city Vision Zero goals are probably not going to be met for this year. And that's really difficult. During the pandemic, I think at the height of the pandemic, not a lot of cars were on the road, and collisions went down by a lot. And so that was great then, but fast forward to now, and we're back at the same point where collisions have increased, people are dying again, and we're not ready to meet those goals. And so we're hoping by conversations like these, by really leveraging our data and really investing in infrastructure, that we can help meet those goals.
Thank you. Craig, tell us a little bit about yourself and telematics and insurance and whatever's on your mind.
You're just making me a target again, aren't you?
Ah, sorry.
I'm Craig Lozofsky. I'm Chief Operating Officer of MOTER Technologies. We spun the company off from a Japanese insurer, Aioi Nisei Dowa Insurance. Not exactly a household name, sure. But in 37 countries around the world, Aioi partners with Toyota to offer insurance to Toyota customers, and in many cases is leveraging data from the vehicles to provide better solutions to those customers. The MOTER Technologies company is focused on building a data science platform to take data from modern cars, turn that into valuable insights that can be used to better understand risk and safety, and then monetize that with the insurance industry. And by monetize, what that really means is helping them build better insurance solutions, particularly for things like mobility fleets. Matt talked about non-emergency medical is one of the key areas that we're focused on, last mile delivery, car share, the different things that we're doing to focus on helping people become more mobile or stay mobile. And what we're doing is trying to take that data from modern cars, which is really move the needle on what telematics can deliver in terms of safety and analytics. If you think about the history of insurance and telematics, and Matt seems like an early adopter of it, which is great. About 25 years ago, companies started putting these black boxes into cars to try to get an understanding of can they measure the risk any individual driver poses much better than just trying to figure out how much they should charge them because they were 35 years old and lived in this zip code and drove this car. And what we found over the last 25 years is that, yes, we can use data to really understand in very precise ways who are riskier drivers, who are great, safe drivers, ways that we can help riskier drivers become safer drivers, and people who should probably not be trusted with the lives with others behind the wheel at the end of the day. And what we've seen now, most recently, with the safety systems of modern vehicles and the data that they produce, there's twofold benefit. One, these safety systems are very effective at reducing a number of types of collisions, in particular rear-end collisions. And the data that the sensors that these systems produces can be critical to truly understand so much more than we ever have about the driving style, and the context which the driving style is occurring, which is maybe the most important part of all. So before, in the olden days, we would say, oh, this guy hits the brakes way too hard on a frequent basis. He's aggressive, he's going to get into a collision. Nowadays, we're able to say, this person follows the vehicle ahead of them too closely while they're distracted on the phone and makes late decisions in their driving. And those are really insightful understanding of risk and how we use that to build better insurance solutions and understand risk and safety, and share that with fleet managers, share that with locality stakeholders, and also how do we help them become better drivers is an important part of what we do. We're all here to save people's lives and improve people's lives. I think that's it for me, Matt.
Thank you, Craig. So Thibault, tell us about Vianova.
Hi everyone, thanks for having me. Yeah, if you're not very much aware of Vianova, like we are mobility data analytics startup. We're based out of Paris and London. We started in 2018, first with actually a first pilot with the city of Paris, where we were managing the drop-off zones for the e-scooters and e-bikes when we had the first like big waves of shared micro-mobility at the time, and it was a mess in cities. And from that, we actually built a product, a shared mobility management platform that we extended to 70 cities now in globally, actually, like Europe, Middle East, America, and New Zealand. So we work with the likes of Amsterdam, Stockholm, Zurich, Frankfurt, and Berlin. And you know, working actually with these cities and the data, and going through COVID, we had a lot of ask from cities about the new cycling lanes planning. You know, at the time there was, 2020, 2021, there was a big move basically to steer like micro-mobility and cycling in cities, and they were actually using like data from micro-mobility flows, and we were helping actually like providing these insights so they could better plan the cycling lanes, yeah. And so from that you had, like a lot of, so Brussels actually like through us developed the Corona lanes, 40 kilometer. If you look at, like other cities like, Chicago, for instance, they added like 48 miles of cycling lanes. Like the plan is to add another 500 miles. So there's been a lot of work on that. I think what we're still seeing is that we're still seeing that the road is very unsafe for cyclists in general. Just to give you some data points, in the last 12 months, there's been a 20% increase in crashes for cyclists in Paris. We're counting now like 10 fatalities in London for cyclists since the beginning of the year, and most of that actually happened on the turn left sort of blind spot for heavy duty trucks, and so this is where the data can be very useful to pinpoint basically like what are the risk hotspots, because essentially like what we're doing now is that we've for the last 60 years we built cities around cars, and I think LA, that's the best example of that. How do we so the public space has been allocated to cars, and now we're saying, okay, no, it's not going to be cars and just cars, but it's going to be cyclists, it's going to be pedestrian, it's going to be AV, it's going to be like like logistics and so on, and all these things like sharing the same public space as increase the safety risk and the modes conflict in general, right? At Vianova, then we looked at the angle of road safety and how could we actually support cities in general. What they used to do and what they're still doing is that they're basically like collecting historical crash data. So basically like the emergency services or the police are basically reporting the data. It's very noisy. Fortunately enough, there's not many, and very, very bad quality, right? So that's what road safety assessment is based on today. So it's very reactive. And when you have a mobility mix that is changing so rapidly, then you're basically like basing your risk assessment on historical crashes that actually don't correlate with what actually is really happening now with all the model mix sharing the same public space, right? So the way that we actually looked at it is how could we actually solve this problem, and how could we be more proactive or even more predictive on the multimodal like safety exposure, specifically for vulnerable road users. And so we start talking to a lot of like OEMs and telematics company, and basically like those guys have a lot of great data. Some of this data we saw what we called like abnormal driving events, so like emergency braking, like harsh turning, speeding, harsh acceleration. All these data basically are extremely interesting data to pinpoint on the public space and see how can they actually like trigger like more critical decision makings about risky areas. So we started building what we called like a risk score. So a risk score for us is a statistical like risk insights that we compute based on several risk factors. One of them is the historical crashes, and the second one is actually what we call the density or the frequency of abnormal driving events. We collected micro-mobility flows as well as pedestrian flows, mostly actually from mobile phones, navigation apps, and shared micro-mobility operators. And from that, basically, we computed this risk score that we piloted actually in several cities. So today it's actually piloted in 2 Swiss cities, and we are piloting that also in the whole country of Sweden. Kind of like iterating with them on the methodology and also doing a lot of like field assessment to figure out, you know, like how to calibrate better the algorithm, how to calibrate better the product. And we even like now doing actually a POC with an OEM, so a car manufacturer, where we're providing back this information to the navigation system of the car, so they get actually notifications every time they're coming into a risky zone, i.e. basically like if you're being routed by Waze, you know, like at 4 p.m. in front of a school, you might get a notification about, hey, you know, that's actually a very dangerous area, you should be careful, you should limit your speed. So that's kind of like the work that we're doing at the moment, yeah.
Very interesting. Congratulations on doing a lot of that work. This is important. And, you know, we'll throw the first question out to the panel. We'll start with Neha, and then everybody else could jump in. But, you know, I guess for the scope of this panel, we're talking, there's tons of safety technologies out there for rail, you know, aviation. We're talking about vehicles on the street, right? When you go out in the street, you got scooters, you got bikes, you got motor vehicles, you got buses. Some are public, some are private. The big question here is, in terms of Vision Zero and taking a step forward and getting crashes reduced, you know, you're talking about vehicles speaking the same language and having sensors, whether they're cameras, black boxes, tapping into the car's computer. You need some way to collect the data and some way that makes sense, like Thibault was mentioning, to manage the data. So how do we make that happen, right? So I think the big question is, what's government's role, or what it should be, in terms of getting, you know, taking it to the next level? I mean, in terms of incentives, do we allow people to voluntarily put these devices in there? Do we have to actually have a heavy hand and say everyone must have one in their vehicle, whether it's public or private? Do we have to say we have to have one system, like kind of like LA's starting to do at DOT, you know, saying we want to have one system, everybody's got to plug in and share their APIs. What are our thoughts on that in terms of what we need to do or what government should be doing? Maybe, Neha, we could start with you since you're from the government.
That would make sense, yes. So I think from a data perspective, one thing that our street safety policy is looking at is kind of organizing our internal data, which we haven't been doing as an agency. So there is a lot of sensor data that we collect from our buses, and we're hoping to leverage it to identify high collision zones or places where collisions almost happened, so that we can use that to identify kind of hotspots of where infrastructure, and so we can be a little bit more strategic about our infrastructure improvements and recommendations. And so that's one thing that we're looking at. Obviously, we're looking at autonomous vehicles and not regulating them, but we're hoping to coordinate with them to make sure that safety, specifically pedestrian and bike safety, is a leading component of those conversations, not just an afterthought. And then from a planning perspective, we're hoping to tie into regional and local plans. There's like I mentioned, infrastructure, in addition to data, is one of actually the leading way to prevent these incidents. And so our department has an active transportation program that helps with improvements, helps fund improvements adjacent to transit areas. So we're hoping that those types of incentives can help, especially for local jurisdictions.
Yeah, let me kick it over to you, Craig, now, just jumping off on that. You know, in terms of the insurance industry, I know they give discounts for people who voluntarily put them in, and we're moving towards like a usage-based insurance model where the premiums are based upon how long you're driving, and you would pay less if you're a safe driver. Like, in your view, in order for us to jump ahead and be safer, do you think that insurance regulators or the state or the government should mandate that every vehicle have it? What are your thoughts on that? Or should we just keep with incentives and discounts and hoping people will be good citizens?
I think we need to keep flexibility for consumers. I don't think that's something we should mandate. There'll be too much of a backlash. At the same time, every car that rolls off the assembly line today can produce data that's powerful for what we're all talking about, that can be shared in a way that's useful for the city, for risk analytics, for insurance. And it doesn't all need to be mandated to be, one flavor of ice cream or anything like that. There's enormous potential in just the kind of lowest common denominator of that data as a stepping stone to what we ultimately will achieve. One of the things that we're focused on as these cars get smarter and more enabled with these safety technologies too, is moving more of the analytics to the vehicle itself. So we could do a better job of utilizing the data even before it leaves the car, which also helps with the privacy concerns that people have, and they'll be more open to allowing both the local communities, insurance companies, the manufacturer to leverage that data to ideally provide them better products and services and safety.
That's a really good segue to Thibault. I mean, when it comes to the collection of the data's there, right? I mean, some people are collecting it directly from these black boxes, but the car has the data. In fact, I think at one point the federal government even said that, the car knows exactly where you are at all times, but the automakers can't share that data, right? And I think that's still the law. I think Senator Schumer was the one who objected to it. But then there's also the data and privacy concerns. There are some telematics apps I've seen where you just have your phone on, and your geolocator is working at all times to collect data on you. So I've even seen telematics being used with the G-forces that go into play with how your phone moves, right? That there are actually all different ways to collect data from a lot of different sources. So with all this data coming in, I guess, people in the private sector and individuals may be wondering what, the government's doing with it, right? And no better place than Europe with the GDPR, right, Thibault, where there's lots of data and privacy protection. So what safeguards does your company and even the government in Europe have in place to make people feel rest assured that the data is being collected for a good purpose, and what could be tapped into and what should and should not be tapped into?
Yeah. So to come back on the data, so which kind of data are we collecting today? So the data that we're collecting today on the automotive and telematics side, it's called floating car data, or FCD. And basically, you have a bunch of data. It's probably 1,000 fields, basically, per timestamp. So it's a lot of data. And among these data, you have the GPS, right? So GPS, so those ones are actually considered under any sort of privacy law, indirect personal data, because you can link basically this data to an individual person, and so you have to apply GDPR or basically apply the privacy law in effect in the country. So so then you have two types of use cases, right? You have fleet-specific, driver-specific use case, and then here you need to get the actual permission from the driver or the fleet manager, and then you get the statistical sort of aggregated use cases, and those ones basically you don't need to get the consent, but you need to label the use case what you're using the data for. So for now on our side, we're using mostly statistical insights. Not yet for you, I guess it's mostly individual driving. But so yeah, depending on that, then you get more or less basically constrained. But I think what is worth noting is that it's the same in the US and same in Europe. In Europe, you have Article 6 of GDPR that basically says from an agency or a transport authority that you can, in lawfulness of actually collecting data and processing data for public interest. So we could think that road safety is public interest, i.e. basically, all transport authorities and agencies are in the right legally to collect this data from telematics OEMs and other fleet operators. Yeah.
Thibault, in the U.S., the problem that we have is that we have this thing called the Freedom of Information Law. And it was passed in, before the 70s, but it got supercharged when we had the Watergate scandal with President Nixon. And basically, there's a general presumption both for government agencies that get their hands on any type of mobility data, as well as state and local agencies, there's an automatic presumption under most state laws that the data has to be released to your competitors, to the press, to anyone who asks for it, right? So this is a problem, and you know, because as governments start collecting data on safety from private vehicles and start collating that data, you know, it raises not just privacy concerns, but how do you protect that data? And there was a great example of this. Some of you may have heard of the FTA's Sandbox program. You know, the money that was put out there for first and last mile partnerships, Uber and Lyft and Via and taxi companies applied for it. You know, the companies and the lawyers spent over a year arguing, putting together data agreements with cities saying, you have to protect our data because we're giving it to you. The reality is that the state laws supersede anything a city does. And if a state law's legislative intent was for the data to be given to the public, as long as it's on a government server, people can get access to it. So we kind of need like a mobility spec and a protection and a federal and a state law that really kind of level sets this whole thing. The workaround, I've published 2 articles on this. The workaround that I see for now, because it's hard to get Congress or the legislatures to move unless it's a real pressing issue. I don't think they're going to be moving on this thing anytime soon. So one way around the FOIA law is to actually have a third-party entity hold the data. So a private entity would have security agreements in place with competitors that are sharing their data from the private industry and with the government, so the government would only pull on a dashboard what it really needs. So all the raw data and the breadcrumb data and the pickups and drop-offs and where people are traveling that are a concern. So that's kind of something that's been a pressing issue for government regulators that are looking to collect mobility data. So I'm wondering if we all feel the same way, that we need some type of standard that should apply for all mobility data.
So I think you need a regulatory framework that is transparent, so people know the rules, right? And I think for that perspective, I think on the if you look at like GDPR or other privacy laws, you have the retention period about personal data. If you're looking at like safety risk, you don't need to keep like personal data from a city perspective. There is no use case for you actually, like maybe enforcement, but that's another one. So you don't actually have like like specific use case to actually hold this personal data, right? But I agree with you that like having the right framework and I think the tricky thing is that when you have vague framework, because people can interpret things in many ways. It's also true that the fact is that GDPR is something that is like very broad. So each industry has to interpret it in their ways, and there needs to be like, like a precedent basically, or there needs to be an investigation to set the rule in the industry, right?
Any other thoughts on that one? John? You want to touch it?
None that I can share.
Okay. I will give my personal opinion before we move on to the last question about mandates. I think in the industries that I've been involved in, we actually do need a mandate. Maybe not for the regular owner of a vehicle or bike. I don't think we need to get into people's business there, but at least for the professional drivers that are on the road, truckers, bus drivers, taxi drivers, TNCs, I think they would welcome a mandate, and I'll tell you why. The way the labor laws work in the United States in particular, if the government mandates that you do something, it can't be held against you in a court of law. So like if you have a bunch of independent contractor gig drivers working for you and you have a taxi fleet, and you tell them tomorrow you all have to wear this clothing, you have to have a dress code, and you have to report to work at 9 a.m., they're going to go and bring a class action lawsuit saying that they're now employees, or they're going to go complain to the Labor Department. The way the laws work in the United States is if the government mandates that you put a camera, that's going to be a safety device in your vehicle, not only, are they going to have to do it, but they're going to probably all be happier because no one's going to resist it, because the fleet owners are not going to be concerned about those lawsuits, and it will bring the price of insurance down significantly. So I just wanted to throw that out there, that in some instances mandates may be welcomed, it makes sense, but You know, do I want to tell, if the government tells me in my private vehicle or my bike that I have to put a sensor on, they're going to track me, I'd probably freak out. So why don't we go back to you, Neha, and before we go to the audience on, like, what future technologies do you see for LA Metro and in general, you know, that will help us move the needle on safety? What do you think is coming down the road? What should we be looking at?
I think that the main thing we're going to be looking at is being more strategic with our internal data. I think that is one of the most powerful tools that we have, one of the most powerful resources that we haven't been able to tap into. And I'm hoping with the development of this policy, working with our external partners and other jurisdictions, we can leverage that data and ultimately save lives.
Craig, did anybody say automated vehicles?
Automated vehicles are great. We're not quite there yet. However, the journey to get there provides a lot of benefits. So whether you call it ADAS level 2, 3, or 4, before you get to fully autonomous vehicles, there's enormous potential for safety improvements and protection of the population and pedestrians and other vehicles and micromobility. Cars that are trained properly don't make the same mistakes we all do. They don't get sleepy. They don't have too many glasses of wine before they get in the car. There's enormous potential on the steps to there, and I think we should all be very open, particularly from a government perspective, to be introducing those more and as quickly as possible. I think there's, with respect to the mandate issue, I agree there could be good opportunities to do that on the commercial fleet level. I would resist probably trying to do that on the personal use level. And to your point, we find that, so we will install AI-enabled dash cams into a lot of our mobility fleet customer partners. And in most cases, they love it. Sure, some guy doesn't want the camera looking at him all day long when he's scratching his head or whatever. But at the end of the day, if something bad happens, they love the fact that they have proof that it wasn't their fault. Or when someone in the back seat of the car is getting out of hand, they love being in a position of breaking out the video. And we can do a really nice job of communicating well to them the pros and cons of installing these systems. And to Thibault's point, transparency in all of this is critical. And so in anything any of us on the stage here do, privacy and security of data that we collect is paramount. Finding ways to appropriately share non-personalized aggregated data for safety or what did you call it? Local use for the benefit of all, societal benefit use. You said it much more properly.
Is it fair to say, Craig, that in light of your comments there, that the Tesla and Waymo and Cruise and all these companies pushing the envelope on full autonomy has led to improvements in terms of their data collection as they test these vehicles that actually went into the models that have in research and development every single year, so that it actually sped up the safety improvements because how they've been pushing forward? Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I don't think we'd be as far down the path if we hadn't, broken a few rules along the way, quite honestly. And mostly that's our friend, down the street at Tesla. And part of it, I think the challenge there was more marketing than anything else, Stop telling people you're driving an autonomous car or a car with autopilot when you're not. At the same time, huge advances have been made in the deployment of these vehicles and the data that they've captured and the situations that they've captured so they can further improve the system. So yeah, there's a lot of benefit that we've made over the last 3 years even in the advancement of these safety systems.
Thibault?
Yeah, I think I'll close out by 3 things. So the first one, yeah, I agree on the ADAS side. There is a lot of new technology happening. As a matter of fact, actually, by 2024, you will have the VRU detection mandatory in every car coming out. So 2024 is seen as the industry as the time where 100% of the cars sold will be connected. So it's kind of like the time frame where. So there's a lot of things gonna happen, you know, like on the ADAS system. Number two, I think I wanted to give an example about Dubai. So what's happening in Dubai is that all the fleets, so logistics, limousine, taxi, buses, trucks, got a license to pay to Dubai, right? Every year, every month, there is a monthly license. They're all equipped with telematics. Depending on the driver and the risk profile of the driver, the fee is actually decreasing at the end of the year, right? Depending on how risky or you know the driving behavior of the driver. And I think that really shows, you know, like implementing the telematics in all the commercial fleets, capturing the data, and then having the sticks and the carrots to make sure that it works. And I think the last one that I wanted to mention is that we talk a lot about technology, and I think I had a question for everyone here, and I think there's a lot of people here from New York. So, do you guys know why Park Avenue in New York is called Park Avenue?
I've lived in New York all my life and never thought about that.
Clearly,
Clearly, people are not parking there. It's not allowed.
So Park Avenue.
Coaches? I don't know.
So Park Avenue is called Park Avenue not because it's leading to a park, but because it used to be a park. So early in the 20th century, there was only one lane, and the rest was a park. Now it's a 4x4, right? So it's very tricky for like any sort of regulator, even if they impose like 20 or 25 miles per hour on a 4x4, with, you know, the driver behavior respecting basically this rule, right? So I think it's a lot about street design, and you know, if you look at also, like, there's a big example happening in Edinburgh. They put like it's all limited at 20 miles per hour. They saw first like a 38% decrease in number of crashes, and then they saw another 50% decrease in crashes when they were doing so what we called here like calm street, or so basically like, you know, streets with you know, like a lower number of lanes, and I think, you know, those ones are really, really important. Like, how do we design streets? How do we allocate space? I think that actually will change the speed of the cars, the vehicles. Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. I absolutely complete street design, street art. Street art is actually known to decrease fatalities, lower speeds in areas. It doesn't have to be, we don't need to change everything in the world just to reduce, you know, to get to that point. There's a lot of things that we can do on the ground, very easy things, but I completely agree, Thibault.
Yeah, and in the future, I think we're going to have to end up sharing data more. It's so critical. There's so many uses and applications for it. You got automated enforcement. You got looking at the data to find the hot spots. You have the cars data. It's all pointing towards a singularity, which is that ultimately public and private transportation at one day are going to be combined with one payment method, mobility as a service, and there's going to have to be all the technologies talking to each other. It's kind of like, it's almost like there's these different planets circling, and they're starting to get closer and closer and accreting, and it sounds like that's where this movement is going right now. It's holistic, it's organic. There's not somebody sitting down, you know, behind a screen saying we got to do this, that, and the other thing. It's almost as if the industry and the government are all doing different things, and it's all this becoming a commonality of data sharing and policy. You could see it in a lot of different areas, so it's kind of happening on its own. You know, and you know, I'm a big fan of the multimodal agency, like Singapore's LTA, Dubai's RTA, Abu Dhabi, London's TfL. I also think that government needs to look at consolidating control for purposes of having all modes under one roof with common leadership. Not to create a big stir here, but you know, if you're able, the one path to success in getting all these modes to be tracked and to get data together is to have operational control or legal control of them from the government standpoint. In my industry, it's very fractured. You know, the Atlanta Police Department regulates taxis. It's the California Public Utilities Commission for limousines. It's the Business Affairs Department in Chicago. It's all over the place. No one's in charge. And we want to talk about, seriously, about automation and connectivity and getting all these modes working together with mobility as a service, we must take a look at the governance structure, a problem for another day. Unfortunately, it looks like we're out of time. So I'm sure there's some questions here, so if you do have some, come and see us right after. But I want to thank our panelists. Let's give them a big round of applause for tackling this tough topic. And let's all try to strive to get safer day by day and keep up the good fight. A lot of people at this conference doing great things, both on the public and private side, to save lives, and that's what it's all about. So thank you.